issue of is that they're misnamed. They should be called big ocean states because they have to manage very large areas of the ocean. And these are countries with very small numbers of people, so they have very limited resources to do management of their natural resources, including water. In some countries, there is only one person in charge of water, and they do everything from advise the President on water policy to changing pumps. So very difficult, very limited resources. They are very diverse, culturally, geographically, incredibly diverse, economically diverse areas, and very complex. This figure here of the rainfall distribution across the Pacific, we don't understand the big drivers of climate, even in the Pacific. They are very vulnerable, extremely vulnerable in these small island states to extreme events and to climate change. Very, very vulnerable as well, and partly because of their geographic isolation as well. They're very adept at using a whole range of water sources. And, for example, for washing, often they use the sea to wash in because they have such limited fresh water. But a whole range of different sources that they can draw on, including desalination. The history of desalination, particularly in the Pacific, is that most desalination plants last about 12 months. They are simply too complex for small island countries to run. The UN General Assembly, as we said, have identified water issues in particular in small island states last year in Samoa. Climate change and sea level rise, the gravest threat. And you can understand when you live in a country that's only 5 metres above mean sea level, that's a real issue. But in terms of fresh water, pollution, overexploitation, saline intrusion, drought and water scarcity, and also the environmental sound management of waste. When you live in a very small island, what you do with your waste is really important. It normally ends up in the groundwater. Climate change, I've said that's, if you're only a few metres above mean sea level, the impact of rising sea levels, which we know are happening, is a major issue. And interestingly, there's been a recent study that's looked at the major risks to water security. Climate change to 2030 doesn't even enter into it. Increasing water demands, large losses, pollution of water resources, non-sustainable water extraction, poor water governance, limited capacity and management, inadequate monitoring, property rights disputes between landowners and governments about water, all critical issues. The most vulnerable areas are urban areas. Some of these atolls have population densities that are higher than Tokyo. Remote communities, peri-urban areas where people are coming in from remote areas and settling around urban areas, and the low islands, I've already mentioned how vulnerable they are. This just gives you an idea of the problems that they face. This is looking at predicting how much water an atoll will need over the next 20 years. And what you can see is there is a huge gap between what they can actually supply safely and what their demand is. And the big problem with estimating this for this population was the demand was largely unknown. The losses were unknown. Here we estimated the losses at 50%, but in fact the losses are closer to 70%. And when you have very scarce water, that's a huge loss. Production, we don't even know the production because the meters are old and don't work properly. And the quality of the water is treated and then pumped 30 kilometres down a line. At the end, it's an intermittent supply, so there are bacterial films build up. We don't know what the quality is down at the supply end. Pollution of water resources. This is an example of a country that has a legislation that prohibits the land use in the water supply, groundwater supply area. You can see the E. coli pollution from illegal use of the land. They have great regulations, but it's not enforced. And so the land use on water reserves is a major issue, protecting those water sources. And I've already said that the Millennium Targets for both water and sanitation are not going to be met by Pacific Island countries. And predictions are for the next 20 years that they will go even backwards because of the rapidly developing populations. There is a real health impact in not meeting those demands. This is just, this shows you the diversity in Pacific Island nations, but it also shows the impacts in terms of the fatality to waterborne diseases for children under the age of 5. huge impacts, great waste of human life that is preventable. There is a real need for very simple methods of monitoring human pathogens. We tried one example with detecting H2S. Unfortunately, it's easy for communities to use, but it gives too many false positives. What I want to emphasise is there are no simple technological fixes. And this is a very good, well-designed sewage treatment works that was installed in an island that has no continuous source of power. It doesn't have the capacity and resources to maintain it, and so it's leaking sewage everywhere. So what they've done is taken the diffuse source of pollution and converted it into a point source of pollution, which is having a major effect. Here's another one, solar-powered water treatment. In Pacific Island nations, a battery lasts about 1 year. So once the battery ends, the government doesn't have the resources to replace the battery, and so that means at night time, when there's no solar energy, there's no water treatment. It also requires a reliable source of calcium hypochlorite. The supplier is at least 1,000 kilometres away. If the boat doesn't arrive, you don't have a source of disinfectant. I talked about seawater intrusion. These atolls, particularly the low atolls, exist on a very thin veneer of fresh water floating over seawater. And so it's very vulnerable to changing climates, it's very vulnerable to over-extraction. And so it's absolutely critical with these freshwater lenses that they are monitored correctly. There are well-established methods. We can use electromagnetic induction, but you actually have to have wells where you know the thickness of the groundwater lens. Really critical, quite expensive to put in, but absolutely vital for managing. Okay, so a way forward, build on the island's strengths, look at what they want to do. The policy lessons we know are actually involve the constituent groups, particularly the governments. They're critical to engaging in policy development and policy based on sound knowledge. So that's where monitoring is incredibly important. The challenges that still remain are government and community support, critical, knowledge-based policies, effective monitoring systems, protection of water sources, absolutely essential, appropriate sanitation systems that they can manage and use, appropriate water treatment. This is just an example of some hollow fibre membranes that we've used to treat water in some islands. Capacity building and monitoring, absolutely critical. Thank you very much.